January of 1933, Hitler becomes chancellor. As a result of the fire of the Reichstag in February of 1933, Hitler is afforded wide-ranging police and political powers.
What if the choices that shaped one of history's most feared armies were not as straightforward as we thought? For years, historians have examined Germany's war machine, but the full story behind its tanks has remained a mystery. Now, the curtains are being pulled back, and what they reveal is shocking. Why did the Nazis insist on gasoline engines when diesel was available?
In uniform and goose-stepping their way down the Platz and raising their arms in salute to Adolf Hitler.
And most importantly, how did this hidden choice ripple through the battles that changed the world? Stay with us, because what we're about to reveal could change everything you thought you knew about the Nazis. How Nazi tanks changed the game. When World War II began in 1939, Germany was no longer the broken nation it had been after World War I. The Nazi Party had come to power, promising to restore the country's pride and strength after the humiliating defeat of 1918. They rebuilt the military, poured resources into new technology, and prepared for war in a way the world had never seen before. Germany was determined to rise again and reclaim its place in the world. And by the time German soldiers invaded Poland, they were equipped with advanced weapons, highly trained soldiers, and a strategy designed to shock and overwhelm their opponents. This invasion was more than a military operation. It aimed to send a clear message to the world that Germany intended to fight on its own terms. Every division demonstrated a nation ready to assert its power with speed, precision, and determination. By the spring of 1940, German soldiers attacked France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. At the forefront were the Panzer divisions, which were Germany's fast-moving tank units designed to strike quickly and decisively. These tanks moved across towns and countryside with engines roaring and armor glinting in the sunlight. People on the streets watched nervously or fled, knowing these machines were there to take control, not just pass through. Here's the kicker. Whenever these tanks appeared, everything changed, and before you knew it, the streets were emptied, shops closed, and the deep, steady sound of the engines became something people feared the most. The Nazis knew exactly what they were doing. This was more than a military display of power. It was a psychological pressure designed to scare and weaken anyone who might resist, even before any fight began. However, behind this display of power was a decision that most people never noticed: the choice of engine. It might seem like an unimportant technical detail, but in war, an engine can decide how far a tank can travel, how fast it can go, and how easily it can be refueled. These factors can make the difference between winning and losing a battle. Germany could have chosen diesel engines, which were safer, more fuel-efficient, and better for long campaigns. Instead, they went with gasoline. To understand why the Nazis insisted on gasoline, despite the clear advantages of diesel, we need to look closely at their strategy, their obsessions, and the way their war machine really worked. In war, even the smallest details, like the engine beneath a tank's hood, can change the outcome of entire campaigns. Also, this was not just some random decision. In Nazi Germany, military choices were shaped not just by engineering, but by politics, resources, and the personal influence of those in power. Generals, designers, and political leaders all had a say. But when Adolf Hitler had an opinion, it could override even the most practical advice. Before we can understand why every engine choice mattered, we need to understand the people behind the tanks. Who were the Nazis, and what drove them to build a war machine unlike anything the world had seen? What kind of leader demanded tanks that were as much about show as they were about survival? To answer this, we need to look at the rise of the Nazi Party, the vision of its leaders, and the world they wanted to create. Their tanks were never just machines. They were symbols of power, obsession, and control. Why did the Nazis choose this type of engine for their tanks? And why did they not follow the path other nations were taking? Let's dive deeper into this video to find out. The Nazis. By the late 1930s, Germany was still struggling to recover from the aftermath of the First World War. The defeat had left the nation humiliated, its economy was in shambles, and millions of people were desperate for change. The high rate of inflation, unemployment, and social unrest created the perfect conditions for a political movement that promised strength, order, and revival. It was in this environment that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party, rose to power. At the center of this movement was Adolf Hitler, a man obsessed with strength, control, and technological dominance. He vowed to restore Germany's pride, rebuild its economy, and create a nation that could command respect across the world. His vision was bold and ruthless, appealing simultaneously to hope, fear, and anger. Using propaganda, mass rallies, and strict control of the media, the Nazis shaped public opinion and drew ordinary citizens into believing in a national revival. By 1933, Hitler had become chancellor, and within months, Germany began transforming into a totalitarian state. Political opponents were silenced. Any challenge to the authority was dealt with firmly, and new laws tightened Hitler's grip on power. Factories that once produced civilian goods now focus on tanks, guns, and airplanes. Railways and roads were upgraded to move troops and supplies efficiently. Every aspect of society, including industry, agriculture, and education, was directed towards supporting the growing war machine. Of course, the Nazis did not just want a strong army. They aimed for control through speed, technology, and careful strategy. One of their most famous tactics was called Blitzkrieg, also known as lightning war. This approach was designed to strike suddenly and powerfully, combining fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, and airplanes to overwhelm the enemy before they could think of reacting. And at the center of this plan were the Panzer divisions, Germany's powerful tanks. These machines weren't just vehicles, they were designed to punch through enemy defenses and keep rolling forward, never slowing down. Wherever they appeared, they created chaos, scattering troops and leaving little time for the enemy to regroup. The Panzers didn't just fight battles, they dictated how the battle would unfold, showing the world just how ruthless and precise the Nazi war machine could be. When people talk about Panzer divisions, they often imagine just tanks rolling across the battlefield. But here's the truth. A Panzer division was more like a moving war machine, a self-contained army on wheels. At the heart of it were the tanks, those steel beasts with their long-barreled cannons, but they never traveled alone. No, they were surrounded by infantry and trucks and half-tracks, artillery guns, engineers, supply vehicles, and even motorcycles scouting ahead. Together, they created a deadly parade of metal and manpower, all moving with one purpose. The tanks themselves set the tone. In the early years, you would most likely see Panzer III and the Panzer IV. The Panzer III was slim and painted in dark gray, which made it look ghostly as it emerged from smoke and rubble. It had a small but fast-firing gun and a crew of 5 men, each trained for a specific job, while the Panzer IV was bigger and stronger, and over time it became the backbone of the German army. Its cannon was upgraded to punch through even the toughest defenses, which made it feared across Europe. However, the real legends of the show came later. The Panther and the Tiger. These were not ordinary tanks. They looked like castles of iron on tracks. The Tiger, with its thick armor and massive 88mm gun, could destroy enemy tanks before they even got close. Allied soldiers reportedly said just hearing the rumble of its engine in the distance was enough to send a chill down their spines. Here's the kicker. What stood out most about these machines was not just their armor, but how fast and mobile they were. German tanks could climb steep hills, charge across muddy fields, and roll through small villages with shocking ease. Yeah, you heard right. And that was the secret behind Blitzkrieg. Tanks would break through defenses, infantry would move in to hold the ground, and aircraft like the Stuka dive bomber circled overhead, bombing supply lines. It felt like everything moved in perfect sync, a storm of speed and firepower sweeping across the battlefield. The goal was not only to destroy buildings or win battles, it was also about fear, intimidation, and breaking people's spirits. Imagine standing on a silent street and suddenly hearing the ground shake, only for you to look up and see row after row of gray tanks rolling forward, their cannons swiveling, engines growling, and soldiers marching beside them. Civilians and soldiers alike often described it as terrifying, not only because of the destruction that followed, but because the panzers symbolized Nazi dominance. They looked like machines that could not be stopped, and that right there was the picture Germany wanted the world to believe. Now that we understand who the Nazis were and how they operated, let's take a look at why the Nazis rejected diesel engines, even though they knew all the disadvantages and dangers of their choice, and how that choice shaped the war itself. Why the Nazis refused diesel engines. There are many reasons the Nazis insisted on gasoline, even though diesel engines were the best option. And top of the list was production. Diesel engines for big tanks required different tools, machines, and factory setups. But at that time, Germany's factories were already busy at full capacity producing airplane engines, weapons, and ships. That meant there was no room to stop and retool everything just to build diesel engines. Also, switching to diesel would have slowed production and risked delaying the entire war effort, something Hitler and his commanders were unwilling to accept. German factories were already set up to mass-produce gasoline engines with maximum efficiency. Every part, from pistons to fuel systems, was designed around gasoline. Changing to diesel would have meant redesigning equipment, slowing down deliveries, and disrupting the entire supply chain. And given how Germany wanted to move at lightning speed during the war, time was valued far more than safety or long-term efficiency. Beyond production, experience also played a major role. German engineers already had years of practice with gasoline engines, many of which were adapted from cars and airplanes. This meant they knew how to build, repair, and maintain them quickly. Diesel engines, however, were a different story. They required new skills, extra testing, and a longer learning curve. Taking that time would have slowed the war effort, and for Germany, racing through Europe with rapid campaigns, speed mattered more than careful adaptation. It didn't end there. Politics and industrial influence also played a major role in their decision. Companies like Maybach, which supplied engines for most Panzer and Tiger tanks, were experts in gasoline engines. Their close ties with military planners made gasoline the best choice. Even when diesel was discussed, the priority remained keeping production steady and factories running efficiently. Experimenting with new technology was seen as too risky, and maintaining the flow of tanks to the front lines mattered far more than exploring alternatives. Strategically, gasoline engines fit perfectly with Hitler's obsession with speed and spectacle. Germany wanted to send a message to the world that they were powerful and should be feared, and these engines helped it do just that. Gasoline-powered tanks were lighter and could deliver sharp bursts of acceleration, allowing them to move faster and reach higher top speeds. This was exactly what Blitzkrieg needed, a sudden and overwhelming strike that left enemies stunned before they had time to react. Diesel engines may have been safer and more fuel-efficient, but they were heavier and slower. For the Germans, the ability to strike quickly, shock their opponents, and maintain the image of unstoppable power mattered far more than efficiency or safety. Unfortunately for the Nazis, things did not turn out as smoothly as they had hoped. Gasoline engines carried serious risks. You heard that right. They were highly flammable, which meant that if a tank was struck, it could erupt in flames within seconds. The diesel engine, on the other hand, was safer and less likely to explode. When the war started, German commanders brushed off this danger because they believed their tanks were so fast and mobile that they would not stay under enemy fire long enough to be hit. In their minds, speed and quick strikes would protect the crews, so the risk of gasoline fires was seen as a price worth paying for power and mobility. Some German engineers reportedly warned about the dangers of sticking with gasoline. They argued that diesel engines were not only safer, but also more fuel-efficient, which could have given tanks a greater range, an advantage when supply lines were stretched thin during long campaigns. But their warnings were brushed aside. The Nazi leadership was fixated on quick results, raw speed, and the dramatic display of massive tank formations rolling across the battlefield. For Hitler and his commanders, the priority was always the next attack, and the powerful image of panzer divisions storming forward to intimidate anyone who stood in their way. This is when the strategy began to show its cracks. Initially, it seemed flawless. German tanks raced through Poland, France, and the Soviet Union with remarkable speed and power. Gasoline engines provided the fuel for these sudden attacks, and supply lines were still manageable. Panzer divisions quickly became symbols of German engineering, earning respect from soldiers and leaving civilians in awe. However, as the Allies seized control of more oil resources, the limitations of gasoline engines became impossible to ignore. By 1942, the problems had grown worse. German tanks were consuming far too much fuel, and the supply lines bringing fuel, ammunition, and repairs over long distances could no longer keep up. What had once been their greatest strength, mobility, now became a serious weakness. Tanks stalled in the middle of battle, crews were left stranded, and mechanical failures became increasingly common. Every loss, whether from fire, engine trouble, or empty fuel tanks, could be traced back to the critical decision to stick with gasoline instead of switching to diesel. In the end, sticking with gasoline engines reshaped the battlefield. It put tank crews in greater danger and made Germany's armored forces more vulnerable than necessary. What might have seemed like a minor technical choice turned out to influence every campaign. The Nazi obsession with speed, raw power, and dramatic displays of strength carried hidden costs that were felt from the Eastern Front all the way to Normandy. Here's the truth. The Nazis' refusal to use diesel engines was about far more than machines or fuel. This choice shows a leadership willing to sacrifice safety, efficiency, and long-term planning for immediate results and impressive displays of power. What might appear to be a simple engineering decision actually reveals deeper truths about their priorities, obsessions, and the way they waged war. Now that we understand why the Nazis stuck with gasoline engines instead of switching to diesel, even when the war was starting to turn against them, let's take a look at what their decision cost them. The consequences of sticking with gasoline engines. By 1942, the myth of the German tank's invincibility was starting to crack. The Panzers still looked powerful, their engines roaring across fields and towns, and on the surface, they seemed unstoppable. Fuel consumption was already high, but supply lines were just keeping up, so crews could still push forward without immediate worry. Soldiers and commanders alike still believed in the aura of German superiority that had carried them to victories in 1939. However, beneath all that speed, armor, and noise, serious problems were quietly building. Gasoline engines overheated, broke down under strain, and made tanks highly flammable. Every stalled vehicle, every engine failure, and every supply delay revealed a vulnerability that, if exploited by the enemy, could, and eventually would, change the outcome of the war. The unstoppable machines of early campaigns were no longer invincible, and the hidden weaknesses inside each tank were about to shape battles for years to come. The first problem that really became obvious was mobility, or rather, the lack of it. Gasoline engines gave German tanks power and speed, but they consumed fuel at an alarming rate. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into enemy territory, supply lines had to stretch across hundreds of miles, often through rough, damaged, or non-existent roads. Every mile became a struggle. Tanks that had once ruled the battlefield now began to stall, not because of enemy attacks, but simply because they ran out of fuel. Crews were left stranded, and vehicles were left idling on dusty roads. The very engines that had once made these machines symbols of German strength were now silently sabotaging their effectiveness, turning their most celebrated advantage into a serious vulnerability. It didn't stop there. Mechanical failures added to the problems caused by high fuel consumption. Gasoline engines were temperamental, prone to overheating, and demanded constant maintenance. Long campaigns far from repair depots turned keeping tanks operational into a grueling task for both crews and support units. Every breakdown created gaps in the lines, exposed soldiers to enemy attacks, and delayed crucial operations. The psychological strain on tank crews was immense. Every mission carried not only the danger of combat, but also the constant fear that a single engine failure could leave them stranded and vulnerable in the open. Then there was also the danger of fire. Gasoline is highly flammable, and a single lucky hit from a gun or artillery shell could ignite a panzer in seconds. Early in the war, German leaders believed that speed and maneuverability would keep crews out of prolonged danger. That assumption worked for a while, particularly during the lightning advances of 1939 and 1940. But as war dragged on, the risk became much more serious. Tanks destroyed by fire became a common sight, a stark reminder that raw power carried hidden costs. Diesel engines, far less prone to ignition, could have prevented many of these losses, but by that point, switching was no longer an option. Long supply lines made fuel shortages even more severe. Every operation depended on the careful coordination of gasoline shipments. In Russia, the distances were vast, and the infrastructure was often poor. In North Africa, convoys had to cross deserts under constant threat from Allied air attacks. One delayed or missed shipment could leave entire divisions stranded. German commanders were frequently forced to pause offensives simply to wait for fuel, a problem that more efficient diesel engines would have minimized. The impact of sticking with gasoline was felt at every level of the military. Strategically, panzer divisions lost their greatest advantage: mobility. What had been the cornerstone of Blitzkrieg, rapid, overwhelming strikes, was now uncertain. Every stalled tank and stranded crew turned a former strength into a liability. Operational plans had to be adjusted constantly, forcing commanders to react to circumstances instead of driving the battle forward. Life inside a German tank was grueling and relentless. Soldiers faced constant stress as they operated vehicles that consumed massive amounts of fuel, overheated easily, and could erupt in flames from a single hit. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly under harsh, punishing conditions just to keep the engines running. For the tank crews, every mission was a fight, not only against the enemy, but also against the temperamental machines they depended on. Exhaustion, fear, and frustration became their constant companions, shaping daily life inside the panzer as much as the battles outside. And by the middle years of the war, these problems could no longer be ignored. On the Eastern Front, German units were spread across enormous distances, and supply lines struggled to keep up with the demands of fast-moving operations. Tanks slowed, critical opportunities slipped away, and Soviet forces seized the advantage. In North Africa, many units faced similar challenges, with harsh desert conditions and enormous fuel consumption combining to stall advances and strain his armored forces. Even when German forces seemed to be winning on the battlefield, the hidden costs were severe. The decision to rely on gasoline engines affected every level of the war effort, from the daily struggles of tank crews to the planning of entire campaigns. It's a striking example of how a single technical choice, made in the name of speed and immediate results, can have consequences that ripple across an entire conflict. Germany's tanks had once amazed the world. But by the middle of the war, the very engines that gave them power were exposing weaknesses that their enemies were quick to exploit. By choosing gasoline engines, the Nazis didn't just build powerful tanks. They handed their enemies a weakness that would be exploited at every turn. How the Allies turned weakness into a weapon. Once the weaknesses in Germany's tanks became clear, their enemies moved quickly to take advantage. At first, the Panzers seemed unstoppable, fast, intimidating, and perfectly coordinated. But reports from the front lines told a very different story. Tanks that had once roared across Poland, France, and early Soviet territories began stalling. Engines overheated, crews were stranded, and supply lines struggled to keep up. Allied planners noticed the pattern. Gasoline engines burned fuel too quickly, repairs took longer than expected, and mechanical breakdowns were far more common than anyone had realized. This was not bad luck. It was a built-in flaw. And once the Allies understood it, they began turning it into a serious advantage. On the Eastern Front, Soviet commanders adapted with remarkable speed. They avoided confrontations during the initial Blitzkrieg surges. Instead, they stretched battles out over time, forcing panzers to consume fuel at an unsustainable rate, while pushing engines to their absolute limits. By the time German tanks reached key objectives, many were limping along. Crews were exhausted, and vehicles were straining to keep moving. That was when the Soviets struck. Weakened formations were hit with artillery, infantry, and carefully timed counterattacks. This strategy did not always rely on raw firepower. It relied on patience, precise timing, and exploiting the vulnerabilities caused by Germany's insistence on gasoline engines. The Western Allies, Britain and the United States, were also watching closely. Intelligence teams tracked every German mistake: how much fuel a panzer used during a long push, how long engines could run at full power, and how long tanks needed to recover after being pushed to their limits. These observations became a powerful tool. Allied commanders started planning attacks to hit exactly when German armor was most likely low on fuel, overextended, or far from repair depots. Suddenly, what had once been Germany's most feared weapon became a predictable target. In North Africa, this knowledge proved invaluable. Rommel's Africa Corps, a skilled force of German and Italian troops, relied heavily on gasoline shipped across long and dangerous supply lines. Convoys faced constant threats from Allied aircraft, submarines, and naval patrols. One delayed shipment could leave an entire panzer division stranded in the desert. Rommel's tanks often faltered not because of poor tactics or leadership, but simply because the fuel never arrived on time. Allied planners saw this clearly, and they turned it into an advantage, manipulating the battlefield so that even the most advanced tanks could be neutralized without ever engaging them directly. Air forces quickly became important in this new type of fighting. Allied pilots realized that attacking tanks on the battlefield was only part of the job. The real effect came from hitting what kept them running: fuel trucks, supply depots, and refineries. Every shipment destroyed meant many panzers could not reach the front. Even though the Germans had strong planes and skilled pilots, they could not protect every fuel shipment from waves of Allied attacks. By cutting off the fuel, the Allies turned Germany's strongest tanks into machines that could not move. This was a slower and quieter kind of war. It was fought with careful planning, timing, and maps, rather than just fighting. Every panzer that stopped because it ran out of fuel was a small win for the Allies. The same tanks that had once scared Europe in 1939 were now held back by the very design that had made them so strong. The German crews, who once felt unstoppable, now realized that even their best machines could fail at the worst time. The problems went beyond just running out of fuel. Tanks started breaking down more often, engines overheated, and fires became a real risk when panzers were pushed too hard. Commanders on the front had to plan for tanks stopping in the middle of battles. Units moved more slowly, and chances for quick attacks were missed. What had once been Germany's biggest advantage, speed and showy power, now became a weakness in a war that demanded careful planning, long supply lines, and endurance. The Allies quickly learned how to use this to their advantage. By studying fuel use and how the tanks handled long marches, they could guess when and where German armor would struggle. Attacks, ambushes, and diversions were carefully timed to strike at these moments of weakness. In some cases, whole operations were won before a single shell hit a panzer because the tanks had already stopped or the crews were too tired to fight effectively. Even the confidence of German tank crews began to falter. The same tanks they had hoped would intimidate the world now turned against them. Tank crews knew that a sudden fire, engine breakdown, or running out of fuel could leave them stranded in the open, vulnerable to artillery or infantry attacks. Maintenance teams worked under constant pressure, often for long hours, and sometimes under air raids, just to keep a few tanks running. The constant stress of handling gasoline engines in tough conditions, combined with the enemy targeting supply lines, created a heavy psychological burden across the battlefield. In the end, the Allies were not just fighting German tanks. They were fighting the whole system that built and powered them. By studying how the panzers worked and where they failed, they found ways to turn these once feared machines into a problem Germany could not fully control. The tanks still looked strong, but the fear they once caused had faded. Fuel shortages, constant breakdowns, and overworked crews had quietly weakened Germany from the inside. World War II ended in 1945, when Allied forces from the West and Soviet forces from the East closed in, forcing Germany to surrender without conditions. Germany's focus on gasoline engines, speed, and flashy displays may have looked like strength, but it actually limited tank mobility, caused avoidable losses, and weakened their armored divisions. By studying these weaknesses, planning carefully, and striking at the right moments, the Allies were able to gain the upper hand. This shows that even the most powerful weapons can be defeated with strategy, foresight, and patience. But here's a question that keeps historians and tank enthusiasts up at night. What if Germany had switched to diesel engines in 1940? Imagine panzers that could travel farther without constant refueling, engines that were less likely to catch fire, and machines that could endure long campaigns without breaking down. German tank crews might have been able to push deeper into enemy territory, strike harder, and maintain the speed and surprise that made Blitzkrieg so terrifying. Could a simple change in fuel engine have given Germany a fighting edge that altered battles or even the course of World War II? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.